Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for part two of the case management training series for the Eastern and Western PA CoCs. We will go over a couple of logistics and then pass it over to our trainer, Ken Craybill. So the Eastern and Western PA CoCs offer training opportunities throughout the year for CoC members, including our homeless service provider who work in the communities to build capacity and enhance the resources that you have to effectively do your work in your communities. Hopefully everyone on this training is connected with the CoC, but if you're not, when you get the follow-up email, please let us know. We can help you connect to the continuum of care. So we did send out materials after the last training to all registered users. So if you did not get that email, I'll put an email address in the chat so you can email us and let us know. It should have gone out to all the registered users, both the presentation materials and the recording. And this training today will be recorded as well, and we'll be sending it out. All participants are muted because we have a large group with us today, but we encourage you to use the chat box and communicate with others. Just make sure you select everyone when you put things in the chat so we can all see it. And then Sierra or I will be posting the links in the chat if you're an Eastern or Western PA CoC member to record your attendance for today. So I'm going to pass it over to Ken to take it away for part two of our case management series.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for being here, and good afternoon. I am coming to you from Seattle, Washington, but as I mentioned last time we met, for those of you who were not there possibly, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and so have some familiarity with the states and what the state of the state is there. So I wanted to start today just by acknowledging that you probably did not wake up this morning thinking to yourself, I'm really excited about learning about trauma and the impact of trauma and trauma-informed care. It's just not something we wake up to with a sense of expectation. But I will say that it's such a critical topic that we need to talk about. And I'm going to contextualize this a little bit in my own case management experience. I've worked in homelessness pretty much all my life, and as a case manager for about 18 years or so. And during the time that I was practicing as, working with folks who had multiple issues, one of my roles was to work alongside a psychiatrist who was we were trying to document disability and also just assess where people were and what was going on. And so I was actually involved in attempting to, do these assessments and then even to make a provisional diagnosis of what I thought was going on with the person from the DSM, whatever version it was at that time, I think the 3. And so I was taking a lot of pride, right, in trying to categorize people into these different, sort of slots, if you will, of what their diagnoses were. But I found that increasingly people that I was assessing just weren't fitting in neatly to the boxes, right? They weren't fitting in to these different diagnoses that were being, that were talked about. And what was happening is people seemed to have all kinds of symptoms that crossed over all kinds of diagnoses. So there was mood disorders, but there was also personality disorder kinds of things coming in. And there were thought disorders and psychosis, and there was depression and anxiety. And it was all sort of coming together. And it was sort of like, what's going on here? And it was at that time that I was introduced to a book, and this was in the 1990s. And I'm holding it up here, called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Lewis Herman. And it's one of the seminal books that was written in the last few decades that really began to draw our attention to trauma, but not just car accident type trauma, but the kind of trauma that for many people is long lasting, has often started in early childhood, and has had a significant impact on people's lives. And at the same time, we were beginning to learn about the outcome of, well, actually, it was a little later, but the outcome of the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and realizing that the experience of adverse childhood experiences within the household were much higher than we would have anticipated. And then alongside that, we learned that the impact of that trauma actually had a health impact on people's actual health and likelihood of engaging in certain behaviors that perhaps were going to be more risky for their health, but also their behavioral health. And it was impacting their social and communal lives. And so trauma, even though we still think of it as kind of unspeakable in our culture, is something we're starting to talk about more, but it's also something that we don't easily talk about. And so we're in the midst of this conversation, and I'm sure you've all heard the term trauma-informed care, but it's really a term that wasn't really started to be in use until pretty much in the early 2000s. And we're still learning a lot about trauma and the brain and its impact and all of that. I say that because one of the things that happened for me is my whole way of thinking in many ways was transformed by this notion that people's behaviors are actually a product of their backgrounds oftentimes. That is to say that people are using adaptive behaviors to try to get their needs met, to cope with life, to do the best they can in life, based on what they know, what they've experienced, and also what's going on in their brains. And so we're going to dive into some of that today. And I'll just say the good news, as this image on this slide indicates, that there is recovery that is possible. People can heal from trauma. People can regain their lives. But trauma often just takes our feet out from under us. And so there's some repair work that needs to be done oftentimes. All right. It's never easy to talk about trauma. It can also be something that actually it touches something inside us that maybe our own experiences of trauma or our own having witnessed trauma, whether that's, disasters, natural disasters, or whether that's insidious trauma, racial trauma. It's also related to sexual abuse and physical abuse and neglect and a lot more. So the invitation here is simply to invite you throughout this time together to find a place in your mind, whether it looks like this stream or whether it's some other image, a place you can return to if you feel yourself getting kind of anxious, triggered in some ways, revved up or reactive to something. It may well be that's attached to something that is in your own past that has not yet fully been resolved. And so I just want to encourage you to be safe, take care of yourself in the midst of this, because it can sometimes bring up difficult things for people. So let's talk about what we're talking about. I want to start by just talking about stress. It turns out that stress is everywhere. You know that. And stress can be a good thing and it can be a not so good thing. So there's what we call, the kind of stress that is good stress. Falling in love is great, but it's also stressful, right? You have to sort of be much more aware of how you're acting and what you're doing and be kinder, perhaps. But there's also the good stress of cooking a meal or of getting out of bed in the morning, taking a shower. It provides a sense of sort of impact on your body because you're having to do things out of the ordinary. But we live with that stress. And then there's negative stress. And that might be more related to wearing too many hats, having too many responsibilities, being too hurried or feeling like you can't get enough done, or maybe a sense of perfectionism that creates negative stress for you, or it can come from all kinds of directions. But that's the kind of stress that has some wear and tear on us, right? And it certainly is, I think, endemic to the work that you all do in homeless services, because there are a lot of things that are not right, a lot of systems that aren't uh, providing housing and providing the kind of care that people need. And so we're doing a lot of really trying to work in circumstances that are sometimes really challenging, if not troubling. Now, traumatic stress is yet another thing. And there is crossover here, but traumatic stress starts to help us think about things like intense forms of stress that become overwhelming. They place overwhelming demands on our bodies and our minds, our spirits, our relationships. And here we're talking a lot about intimate partner violence, sexual assaults, hate crimes, severe accidents, the cumulative effects of racism, sexism, homophobia. Homelessness is absolutely a traumatic stressor for people. Community violence, bullying, all of these things are examples of traumatic stress. And what happens with traumatic stress is there's something called an allostatic load that we begin to carry when the wear and tear on our bodies is continuous and is unrelenting in many ways. And what happens is this becomes a chronic stress that begins to literally have an impact on our brains and how they function, and on our bodies and how they function. And it results in higher incidence of negative health behaviors, negative health outcomes, behavioral health outcomes. And it's not the sole cause. It's not necessarily even always causal, but it oftentimes has a high correlation to those things. And then the other kind of stress, which you are very familiar with, is what we call post-traumatic stress. And really what that is that ongoing stress that after a time results in our actually reliving past events in a way that they come back. And they're in the form of flashbacks sometimes, of nightmares, of agonizing bodily sensations, of volatile emotional reactions, those kinds of things. And post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, is a recognized diagnosis that it shows up in different forms. But the most prevalent idea or symptom there is this sense of hypervigilance, of being constantly kind of on edge, of being wary, of wondering where the shoe's going to drop next, of and it sometimes looks like short attention spans because people are being, having to survey the environment. Um, I'm sure you notice this perhaps in yourselves, but also in many of the clients that you serve. And I'm not here to provide a diagnosis, but I am here to suggest that there's a hugely high incidence of traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress within homeless populations, especially chronically homeless populations. And so it would be almost a rarity not to see some evidence of it showing up in the work that you do with folks. And that has an impact on how we work with people. What we know about stress is it has an effect on the body and the brain. And so you and I think, can readily sort of think about times when we felt that adrenaline rush, that cortisol going through our bodies, and what happens? Our bodies kind of become alert, right? And pay attention to that, and get ready, if you will, for either fight or flight or freeze, those common responses to trauma. And imagine having this happen in your body and having, your muscles tense and your skin, having, your skin feeling different kinds of blood vessels constricting. It affects our bowels, our stomach, our lungs, our eyes, our saliva. But imagine being in that state pretty much all the time, maybe even at a fairly low level, but pretty much all the time you're feeling that. That is actually the experience for many people that we serve, that there's that kind of constant. The brain has actually been wired to actually be much more attentive to danger and to what might threaten us physically or otherwise, than it is wired to be creative and playful and enjoyment and that kind of thing. And it's not an either or thing, but it turns out that our brains are there to protect us. And if the brain is sensing that there's something going on that needs to be, that's fearful, that needs to be paid attention to, then our bodies are resulting in that way. So the physiologic stress response is really due to these massive amounts of stress hormones, if you will, that course through our body. I'm going to recommend a book to you. Some of you, I'm guessing, have read it already, or parts of it. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. I'm holding it up and putting it on the slide as well. It's a book by Bessel van der Kolk. It's called The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. There are lots of good books out there, but if you're looking for something that would be a good kind of descriptor of what I'm talking about here in the impact it has on people, and some interesting stories and case examples, and also then what does it mean to be trauma informed, I strongly recommend that particular book for you. So just to reiterate, we're talking here about an overwhelming demand placed upon our bodies. And what happens as a result of that over time is it results in our feeling unsafe and not being in control of ourselves, of feeling like everything is happening to us externally, and we're vulnerable to that. Another definition would be that these traumatic events overwhelm our ordinary systems of care, and it impacts how we make meaning in life, how we, our sense of safety, our sense of connection, and all of those kinds of things. So what makes an experience traumatic? Well, there has to be an experience that happens that involves some kind of a threat to us physically or emotionally. And a one-time overwhelming experience can be really life-changing and impactful on us. What happens, though, is for people who have, shall we say, good coping skills, have the ability to bounce back maybe more readily because they have other supports in their lives, it may be that they can get through that one event relatively unscathed, if you will. But then there are others who might experience the same event who experience it very differently. So it's not the event itself that causes the trauma. I mean, it does, but it's really the response to the event that really results in the longer term impact of that trauma. And it's overwhelming on our bodies, our minds, our spirits. We aren't able to cope. And so we find ourselves having these intense feelings of fear and lack of control. And again, for some of us, these happen in the moment and then they go away pretty quickly. But for others of us, these linger or they come back intermittently. And we end up feeling helpless, like we don't have agency in our own lives. We don't feel like we have hope to hope for something. Because it's likely not going to be possible, because you get into this sort of idea that only bad things happen to me, right? And I'm sure you've seen and heard this in the work that you do with folks. They can't even see a future. They're totally focused on the here and now and or on the past, because hope is too much to hope for. And our worldview changes, our view of others, our view of ourselves. And then this ongoing traumatic stress is really what happens when we begin to organize our lives as if trauma is always lingering, lurking, present in some way. And then every new encounter or event that happens is in some way impacted, affected by that. So here's the thing about trauma that I think is so important to understand, that long after an actual event has passed, the brain will likely continue to send signals that the body needs to escape a threat, even if it no longer exists. Now, this only happens if that trauma is not somehow resolved and dealt with, and there aren't other protective factors that people have to allow them to make sense of it and make meaning and move on. But for many people, it becomes so overwhelming and so impactful that it shapes the way their lives continue. And without resolving that trauma in some way or another, what happens is our brains keep protecting us to be alert to those kinds of things. Now, at an interpersonal level, trauma almost invariably results in people feeling like you're not really seeing them. Sure, you're seeing them with their eyes, but we hear people experiencing homelessness often talk about walking down the street and people either don't look at them or stare through them or act as if they're not there. And so that's one example of not being seen, not even be acknowledged that you exist, right? And a lot of times trauma, it results in people feeling that and also experiencing it. Of not being mirrored is really referring to this notion that, you know, we learn our way of talking and our emotions by mimicry. We learn through mirroring. When we are held as infants and someone looks into our eyes and you know, says baba back to us when we say baba, you know, that's a form of mirroring, right? There's something about that is connection. It creates connection and it creates a sense of somebody has my back, and it's also how we learn. The idea of not being taken into account is not being believed, not feeling like people you know, they don't even think you're telling the truth and this kind of thing, because sometimes how people speak about things seem sort of out of the ordinary or fantastical, right? I'm going to show you a brief video, and I bet almost all of you have seen it. This went viral about a year or so ago, I think. And this is a video, a few minutes, of a father and son having a conversation. And this is a beautiful example, in my view, of some amazing seeing, being taken into account, and mirroring that's going on. And you can listen to the words. It's kind of an unusual conversation from that standpoint, but you can also watch at the same time the body language and just the sense of what's happening relational between them. So I'm just going to ask you to take a listen. This is the antidote to trauma, if you will. And I'll ask you to think about what it might mean for you in your practice as a case manager to see people even more and to take them into account and to believe them and to have faith or belief in them, right? And just to also have a sheer sense of enjoyment with each other's company. So here we go.
Okay. They need to work on that, right? Yes, okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh, no, not this one. This is the grand finale of this. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
All right. Well, if your conversations look something like that in your case management relationships, you're on good ground. You're doing well. Yeah. So in short, what we're talking about here is trauma actually takes away our sense of healthy connection. It takes away our sense of connection to our own bodies, to our own families and partners and others, and to the world around. And it often happens very incrementally. So we don't see it sort of happen in one big blast, but it happens over time. And for those of you who do provide case management services for people who have been in and out of homelessness or homeless for a long, long time, living on the streets, living in shelters and encampments, there is something that's life draining in that respect that you see in people. And yet it's also just so simply amazing to me how people continue to move on and survive and make the best of the world that they are in. But there is this kind of nagging kind of loss of meaningful connection that they have. And we'll talk a bit more about that. So where does this trauma come from? Well, I think we already mentioned it comes from many different sources. I just want to say that the insidious trauma that we talk about, when I think about that, I think about the aggressive things that happens. I know people call them microaggressions. I don't think they're very micro actually, but the things that happen to particularly people who are marginalized, in poverty, people of color, and so forth, who are discounted, not taken seriously, and are actively followed, and they're held under suspicion, and even worse. It's all of that, that if you live your life carrying that kind of burden, if you will, it's understandable how that would be impactful to our bodies, our minds, our spirits. It's also related to the historical generation system-induced trauma, all of that comes not from interpersonal relationships, but comes from inequitable and unfair systems that favor and give advantage to white men like myself, more so than to many other people. So all of these are sources of trauma. When we talk about types of trauma, this is a bit of a fiction, I suppose, but there is one-time event trauma that is can be very impactful, depending. I mean, if it's like a hurricane came in and wiped out your house and home and that kind of thing, or something like that. It's not necessarily related to the Pittsburgh Steelers losing a game or the Philadelphia Phillies losing a game. It's something more dramatic than that, right? But when it becomes chronic, when it occurs time and a time, and maybe it results in, there was an event, but then there's maybe underlying sort of bias and kind of, sorry, I can't find the word I'm looking for, discrimination that people experience. And maybe also you're finding that you're drinking more, and so that's creating problems. And then you find that you're having relationship problems. And so chronic trauma can come from lots of different sources. One of the things that we are talking about more so here is what we're calling complex or developmental trauma. And this typically is something that occurs when people in early childhood, in their formative years, are put in a position, as Judith Lewis Herman says, of having to trust people who are inherently untrustworthy. So think about that for a moment. Having to trust someone who is inherently not trustworthy. In other words, they might act in kind, caring ways, but in the long run, they also act to exploit you or take advantage of you or to abuse or to neglect you. And so there's that kind of mix of mixed messages, but also behaviors that really don't provide genuine respect for the person and see them more as an object to be using for their own purposes. This kind of trauma that happens is something that I'll send some reading about, but it's the kind of trauma that I will suggest to you that many of the people you're working with have had these experiences. And whether you know about them or not, it's likely, and not necessarily always, but likely that they've had pretty significant childhood trauma that has resulted in certain behaviors and ways of seeing the world, et cetera, that has a major impact on their lives. I'm going to read you a passage from this book about Anthony, and I'll just ask you to listen and see what comes up for you, and even see if this might ring true with some of the experiences you have heard about when people have talked to you about their childhoods. Anthony was only 2.5 when he was referred to our trauma center by a child care center because its employees could not manage his constant biting and pushing, his refusal to take naps, and his intractable crying, headbanging, and rocking. He did not feel safe with any staff member and fluctuated between despondent collapse and angry defiance. When we met with him and his mother, he anxiously clung to her, hiding his face while she kept saying, "Don't be such a baby." He startled when a door banged somewhere down the corridor and then burrowed deeper into his mom's lap. When she pushed him away, he sat in a corner and started to bang his head. "He just does that to bug me," his mother remarked. When we asked about her own background, she told us that she'd been abandoned by her parents and raised by a series of relatives who hit her, ignored her, and started to sexually abuse her at age 13. She had become pregnant by a drunken boyfriend who left her when she told him she was carrying his child. Anthony was just like his father, she said, a good for nothing. She had had numerous violent rows with subsequent boyfriends, but she was sure that this had happened too late at night for Anthony to notice. If Anthony were admitted to a hospital, he would likely be diagnosed with a host of different psychiatric disorders: depression, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, reactive attachment disorder, ADHD, and PTSD. None of these diagnoses, however, would clarify what was wrong with Anthony, that he was scared to death and fighting for his life, and he did not trust that his mother could help him. I don't know the stories you've heard from folks, but sadly, that kind of a story where he was not seen, not taken into account, not believed, not cared for properly, is one that many people have had to survive and make the best that they can do in the world. And I'm not saying it's the cause of homelessness, but it often can create the conditions under which becoming homeless is more likely to occur. And so there's a correlation there. Now, I want to also point out in that story the mom, because it's really easy to get real judgy about mom, right? Especially when I was first reading the few comments she made. And then we learn that there's a whole generational trauma there, that she herself was treated in the same way. And we will see this a lot in our homelessness work as well, where generation upon generation passes on, if you will, this trauma. And there's even some studies in epigenetics these days that there might even be a genetic kind of imprint, if you will, that gets passed on around trauma. So this is the bad news, right? This is the hard news, but it's what we need to face up to and recognize is out there. And of course, it might not be as dramatic as the story of Anthony, but nonetheless, there's lots of different ways that trauma creates drama in people's lives, actually. I'm going to ask you to participate here for a moment. We can use a lot of metaphors for trauma. One of those is a thief. What would you say gets stolen? If you wouldn't mind just chatting, putting in the chat box, just put out some thoughts, word, phrases. What gets stolen in all of this? Yeah, identity, innocence, trust, identity, time, peace of mind, peace, value, trust, freedom, optimism, your childhood, absolutely, your sense of self-worth, your faith, your ability to believe in something bigger than yourself, your sense of character and who you are, and your sense of focus and more, and happiness. Yeah, you know what that is, right? And so I was quickly writing down everything in the chat box. No, I wasn't really, but here are some things that you've mentioned, and maybe a few more too. There's so much that gets robbed from people. And so this is obviously something that's a huge, actually, trauma is considered a huge public health issue in our world, because trauma is much more prevalent than we would want or wish it were. And so before we move to more of a trauma-informed approach, I'm just going to ask you to again, participate and just complete this sentence stems with a word, maybe a phrase. How might survivors of long-term trauma complete this stem? The world is, what gets shaped in their view of the world? How do they begin to see? It's an unfair, unsafe, untrustworthy place, right? And it's out to get me. Yeah, yeah. And sometimes the paranoia that we think we see in people might really be related more to something that's real in their lives, right? And their scariness and unreliability and meanness and all of that. Yeah. They always think that I am making things up. They always think that I am failure. I'm the problem. Yep. I'm being overly dramatic. I'm crazy. Yeah. I'm exaggerating. I'm unstable. I have a victim complex. That's an interesting one. You know, I see myself only as a victim, and I'm overthinking things, and I'm taking things too seriously. I just need to lighten up, right? I will never be. I will never be worthy, good enough, yeah, stable, able to be in a caring relationship, able to get out from under all this. Yeah, I'll never be me. I'll never be myself. I'll never know. I won't even be okay, right? And who I want to be, and I won't be able to fulfill dreams. I'll not be normal, quote unquote. Yes, yes. Healed. I'll never be. I'll never be. And good enough keeps coming up, because I think that's often what we hear, right? And again, we could carry this on. I am unworthy. I am unlovable. I am unable to get along in the world. Now, how about this one? If they really cared, and you know who they is here, right? If they really cared, what would they do or say or be like? They would listen. That's a great starting point, Dakota. Absolutely. They would listen to me. They would take time. They would be unhurried. They would be empathic and supportive. They would help in whatever that means. They would show a sense of deep caring and empathy. They would notice me. Yeah, they would just notice I'm there and see me as a human being, a worthy human being with potential. They'd be patient with me for sure. Yeah. Yeah. They'd be kind. They'd be supportive. They'd be all those things. And let me just say that I trust that all of you are all of these things, at least most of the time, or you intend to be these things. And can I just say, these things go such a long way, and they really are the essence of being trauma informed. And so I want to offer this metaphor or picture image once again. It turns out that it's a Japanese form of pottery that is used when that pottery is broken or shattered. It's an art of mending that pottery with some kind of a lacquer that's often gold, silver colored, or other colored, to put back together, to heal that pot, if you will. But you still see the scars, right? You still see where the breakage was. And so it's not like that ever totally goes away. But what can and does happen oftentimes for people is that recovery is possible. And not only that, but people can often experience something we call post-traumatic growth. Not always, but it's going from not just to survival and getting along and life being okay, but it's actually taking what you've learned from adversity and turning it, and this happens over time, but turning it into a sense of giftedness on your own part and a sense of wisdom that goes beyond what you might have had you not had that experience. And this never, of course, is to suggest that we want this to happen in our lives so we can grow from it. But when it does happen, we want to recognize that people have the capacity in their recovery process to even learn and grow and to become stronger people. And for those of you, particularly who are people with lived experience of trauma, uh, many of you who are case managers, I'm going to guess, are people who have experienced that kind of post-traumatic growth. And you're now at a point where you are choosing to give back and to walk alongside other people in solidarity with them, not to change them, but to let them know that change is possible, that it is possible to heal. So what is trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care? And I'm going to also refer to this as healing-centered engagement at times, and I'll share with you why. But it's really this idea of, in the context of the work that we do, with the recognition of the fact that trauma has played a role in almost everybody's life who we work with, I'm going to guess, and also in ours for many of us. Trauma is not something that just happens to those people over there, and it happens people of all classes and wealth and race and gender. But we do know that people who are tend to be pushed aside by society are the ones who experience it at a greater extent. But how do we use a lens? And here is a video that I'm going to use as a way to sort of talk about this. So I'm going to show you this video. It's a video of Chad. It comes from a group called Changing Minds Now. And I'm going to ask you to view it. It's about a 5 to 6 minute video. And think about what are some of the adverse childhood experiences that Chad experienced, which won't be hard to figure out, but also then how did they impact him? What impact did they have on him? And then secondly, who and what was helpful for him in helping him to begin on the road of healing from trauma? Who made a difference in his life in a positive way? And you'll notice in this video, at least, it's not professionals. It's not people being paid to care. It's nothing wrong with that. But it's people treating him in a way that's different than what he's used to being treated. So again, I'll invite you to watch this. Again, just a safety check. There might be something here that for you hits too close to home for you. Please do what you need to do. Turn off the audio, the video, step away, whatever you need to do to feel safe in this situation. All right.
It's just hard with I mean, I was just a kid. Because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening to us, and it was brutal. Oh my God, there's this school. If you go right up here, there's a turn, and you can situate it.
It's a tough thing back here.
Yeah. This is crazy. There were some good times though, like we'd have a good 30 minutes or so before we heard the sliding glass door open, and one day he came in and he actually had pizza, like supreme pizza. And another day, everything was fine, and another day he came in, for no reason, he just smashed my mom's head against that cabinet there. Just thinking of, just to the left of where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so one time where we're sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, you know, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do. On the whistle,
Coach Morrow was the only person I really trusted in this town. He was always there.
Yeah. There was times I would give him a ride home. We would talk, sometimes we wouldn't talk. But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. Even my family wasn't there.
You're doing good. You're okay.
I just remember, when you were walking across, I just remember looking up. He had this big old... just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. If you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know? You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
When's the last time you saw him?
About 8 years ago. And actually right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took me there, like after high school graduation. But take this right. It's gonna be your first right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but... I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up.
No,
I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew you all were doing something.
No, you didn't. There he is.
I heard you in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Oh, good to see you. I'm so proud of you. Done well. Done well.
I suppose I should have thought about earlier to consider passing the virtual Kleenex for some of you. Yeah, it's a very moving video. So what are the things that you would name that he experienced that were what we might consider adverse childhood experiences, trauma that he experienced? Everyone knowing about the issues in his home. Yeah, that's a good one, important. And he witnessed the violence, right? Alone, angry, fear, neglect, yeah. He was getting these really mixed messages. Sometimes things were okay. Sometimes it was pizza and sometimes it was violence, right? Kind of a false love, yeah, and unpredictability to it. Yeah, not safe. Never knowing what's gonna pop up, what's gonna happen, yeah. What about this one? And I mean, we can say who was helpful, but what was it about those people that was helpful in helping him heal from trauma, to begin the healing process? What did they do? Yeah, particularly the coach, I think, Coach Morrow. Having just somebody be present there, to show up, to be exactly, to listen, to be consistent, sometimes to talk, sometimes not to talk, right? But making them feel safe and celebrating the little things and the big things, whether that's getting knocked down in a football practice and getting up again, or whether it's graduation, right? Somebody to look up to, somebody who's positive in his life. Yeah. And there's a relationship there. I love the phrase he says, Chad wasn't really a football player per se, uh, which suggests to me that this coach was more about not just about winning and losing ball games. He was much more about developing kids and helping them find their own strengths and potential and using them. So yeah, he made a relationship that was meaningful, predictable, as humanly as possible. And again, I'll just reiterate that all of the little things that you do and the big things you do, but I truly believe that trauma-informed care is the sum total of hundreds, if not thousands, of little things we do, small kindnesses, shows of respect, listening well to people, taking into account what their perspective is without judging, and then developing goals, if you will, that are based on what the person is wanting. So being person-centered, right? I think using the skills of motivational interviewing and those kinds of person-centered skills are other ways that we can embody a trauma-informed approach, and so much more. Now, I want to tell you, I take issue with one part of that video, not the video itself, but with how the counselor describes her interaction. And it's not something that, I guess it's not a huge deal. She clearly did a good thing by referring him on to Coach Morrow. But I'd like you to think critically about how she describes Chad. And here is what she says. Chad reminds me a lot of the kids who come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. He finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said he needed to talk. He said he needed to talk to somebody, and I immediately thought of Coach Morrow. I don't know how this comes across to you. I think she's absolutely well-intended, but I do think we need to be careful about our language we use and how we describe people. And in this particular case, what if she had been talking directly to Chad and she had said some of these things? Because for me, and feel free to type in the chat box how your response, but it's almost like she's making him into a criminal, or projecting things on him, or, it's bad that he's angry. It's bad that he's hiding something. It's bad that, he came clean from what, right? As if he had been dirty. And I don't want to be too nitpicky, but I think one of the most important parts of being trauma informed is examining our own attitudes and our own language that we use. And it's just critically important. So I'm going to suggest to you that there might be another way that she could have described him. And I'm going to invite you, if you will, to maybe type in a phrase for one thing you see here that you might have phrased it a little differently to make it a little more person-centered, a little more trauma-informed, a little more focused on Chad himself rather than her projections, as one of you says. So maybe even simply experiencing anger instead of he was angry. Yeah, there's just using that person-first language, right? She could have been more positive. Yeah. Everybody has a different story. Absolutely. There's a backstory that everybody carries. He finally opened up to me, Okay, yeah, that sounds a little better than coming clean, doesn't it? Expressing a need. He was expressing a need through anger. He was sending a message. Something was holding him back from connecting. Yeah, that seems much more client-centered, person-centered, right? He was reluctant to let me in. I wonder what's behind his story. I love the wandering part. I think when we can operate with a sense of compassionate curiosity, that's not voyeuristic, but a compassionate curiosity about who is this person? What helped form them, shape them? What have been their experiences? What happened to them, rather than what's wrong with them, right? Well, you've done a lovely job here in a short amount of time to kind of reframe this. I'm going to just share with you a version that I've come up with that reflects a lot of what you're saying, and just see how this might feel different or sound different. Chad reminds me a lot of the kids who come through here. He was visibly upset and seemed to be holding something inside that was really bothering him. I sensed he might be too afraid or embarrassed to talk about it. You could tell he desperately wanted to connect with someone, but wasn't sure who he could trust. Not surprisingly, his stomach was signaling the stress because the body keeps the score, right? Over time, Chad was able to confide in me about the abuse and violence going on at home with his father. He said he really wanted to talk to somebody who felt safe. And then I suggested Coach Morrow. So this is a discipline that we all need to undertake, I think, because so readily we speak from our own reactivity rather than our responsivity. And I get it. It happens to me all the time. But I also, as one of you said, words can hurt, and it makes a difference how people see you and describe you. And so how we begin to talk with people using language that is much more sort of acknowledging that this is a person living with some difficult things in their lives and huge challenges. And it's not because they're trying to be a big screw up in life. It's because they're doing the best they can to meet their needs in the best way they know how. And I want to tie this for a connection for a moment to connecting it with substance use, because we know that trauma is definitely a correlative. It correlates with trauma. And those of you who have read Gabor Mate's book, in the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, will have heard him make that case very strongly. But when somebody is using opiates, for example, if we understand the context, and I'm not saying everyone who uses opiates has trauma in their lives, but many people will use opiates in particular to reduce pain, to forget, or at least diminish the anguish, to feel good, to have something in their lives that feels at least pleasant for a time. People will use methamphetamine for similar purposes, to have more energy, to feel something, right? People will also, and this is taking it to another direction, but people will also sometimes do self-harm to themselves in other ways. They'll cut on their arms or legs. They'll put burn marks on their skin, some at different places. They'll do things that we sometimes call self-mutilation. And I'm not sure I like that term, but what probably is happening for most of those folks in terms of the dynamic at place is, one of the things we know is that trauma ultimately numbs us out. It takes away our good feelings, right? And so one of the things that this self-cutting or this burning can do is help us feel something, feel anything, to feel alive. And so imagine seeing somebody and thinking to yourself, oh, that person's doing a horrible thing, they're probably suicidal, or thinking, huh, I'm curious, what's that about, you know? And that opens up all kinds of different conversations, right, for us that we can have with people. Yeah, looking at your comments, thank you for those. All right. So why does any of this matter? Well, what we know, of course, is that trauma has a direct impact on people's overall health and well-being. And I urge you to read about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study. I'll send you some materials about it as well. But one of the most impactful studies that in social sciences and behavioral health that we've seen in a long time. And these are continuing. We also know that traumatic experiences have a direct impact on how people engage in services. So I want to pause here for a moment. What are the ways that people engage with you in services and care that are less than user-friendly for you, shall we say. Um, and I'm going to invite you for this time to use the not so helpful terms. But what are the terms we use sometimes or hear others use that make us sort of blame the victim, if you will? I know oftentimes we use the word entitled, right? That person feels they're entitled or they're demanding. What other things do you hear sometimes or think about how we sometimes, unfortunately, describe people's way they engage in services and care? They're resistant, yeah, or they're complacent. They don't want to share. They has a poor history of a history of poor choices. Yeah, they're non-compliant, non-adherent. Yeah, which really just means they don't want to do what I want them to do, right? We call them lazy sometimes. Yeah, difficult and dramatic, and all of these things. Poor follow through. Yeah, all these kind of negative characteristics that seemingly put the blame on the person. And, you know, it's not to say that people don't have responsibility for their lives, but it also suggests that there are many causes and conditions that create in our brains, our bodies, and in our way of being in the world patterns that are really, really hard to break. And so, yeah, that person's a mess. Yeah, at least, yeah, absolutely. So we can replace these terms absolutely with declined versus refused, and just be a little more kind and sensitive and compassionate in our way of how we see these behaviors. And then if somebody does disclose things that have happened, we want to know how to respond to that. And the thing we don't want to do is just gloss over it and say, oh, that's not in my, you know, that's not in my wheelhouse, or that's not part of my job. No, we want to absolutely acknowledge it and acknowledge even that, wow, that sounds awful. And whatever terms you want to use, my God, you know, that's awful. And we also want to, at some level, let the person know that they're not alone in that experience, that you've heard other people say similar things, and give them a sense that this is not normal, but that it is actually something that happens with some regularity to people and you're not alone. And also to say there are ways that you can get help for that. What we don't want to do, of course, is become trauma therapists and dig deep into the trauma and start to unpack it and all that. That's not within our domain, but we can be trauma informed. We also know that knowing the impact of trauma can improve health outcomes as we work with people and also help us better manage risk. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here. So before I provide you my list of ways our services can re-traumatize, what are things that you think about that either you yourself or other case managers or our systems of care or our agencies might be doing that can actually re-traumatize, even if it's not intentional? I mean, and we can't escape it. We often will re-traumatize people, trigger them in ways that we don't intend, but we just don't know what it is. But talking down to people is certainly one way that we can do that. Yeah, treating them as if they're less than, right? The VI spadat, I'm with you on that. Language that is accusatory, yeah, that blames people. Your tone, absolutely, your tone. I'm sorry, I'm missing many of your remarks, which are great. I'm cherry picking because I can't read them all, but minimizing the emotional pain is another great one. Asking too many questions and making them tell their stories over and over and over again. Yep, yep. So again, I'll just list here a number of things in addition to what you're saying or including what you're saying that come to mind. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Touch, which of course during COVID has been not as much of a temptation, but unwanted physical touch is huge. And you know, some people say, "Oh, I'm a hugger," and it's sort of like, that's cool. And don't hug me, you know. And even if they ask permission to hug, you know, we can't assume that people are giving full permission because they feel compelled to do that. So be really careful with touch. I'm not saying it's never appropriate. I'm just saying be careful with it, you know. only one right way for recovery or to resolve issues related to substance misuse, or maybe our own unresolved trauma that we transmit in some way through projection. And then either or thinking, as if there's only two ways to think about something. Well, that's not true. There are many ways to think about something. And rigidity around our policies and procedures. And I know we need them. We need it to keep people safe. And at the same time, I think we need to examine those policies and procedures and see which ones are actually not really in the best interest of clients, but they're just serving to protect us in a way that makes our life easier. Every policy and procedure, in my mind, will have to necessarily have some exceptions based on a person's individual needs. Outside of the most violent and outlandish ones. So when you see people, and sometimes you'll see them being very avoidant, you'll use that term, right? Or they don't want to connect, or they're having difficulty connecting, or they're exceedingly fearful. It may well be that throughout their life experience, on too many occasions, they haven't been seen, heard, taken seriously, or believed. And so why would you, even though you're a perfectly trustworthy person and well-intended, why would they expect you to be any different than that? Because not all service providers are willing to listen and see and hear people, right? So that avoidance might well be a protective mechanism that they engage in to just make sure they're not going to put their lives out there one more time, right? They also might be fearful in putting any trust in you because other people have acted like they're trustworthy only to turn around and control, exploit, abandon them, right? Or maybe they're more comfortable with what I'll call transactional relationships as opposed to more sort of mutual relationships. A transactional relationship is one in which you try to extract as much as you can from the other person and give up as little as you can in return. We do that when we buy cars, right? Or when we buy things in the market. We try to get as much as we can and give up as little money as possible. And that's okay for business. But when it comes to relationships, when you have people coming to you and you're thinking to yourself, that person's just trying to use or manipulate me or get something out of me, they don't really want to have a relationship. It may well be, again, that it's a protective mechanism for them because that's what they know, that's what they've learned, that people are to be used for what you can get from them. They're not to be used for mutual kind of enjoyment and pleasure. So anytime you can engage in something a little lighthearted with people or engage in something that feels like it's more of a real conversation between you rather than a business conversation, that's a good thing. And that all promotes healing, right? Or you have folks who don't keep appointments or follow through with referrals, or, well, we don't know what's going on, but it's possible that it's too complicated, it's too fearful, it's related to not being able to remember. Or we know that in trauma, and we haven't had a chance to talk about the brain, but we know that in trauma, when our amygdala is active and trying to protect us, our prefrontal cortex, which is where our thinking and decision making happens, is actually diminished. The capacity is diminished. And so people aren't going to make necessarily the best of choices. All right. So we want to do this because the most important reason is clients will get better services and care, but we also will gain from it. We'll be able to cope more effectively, and we will be able to be more resilient when we act in a more person-centered way. We won't quit our jobs as readily or burn out, hopefully. That we will experience vicarious secondary trauma, but it won't be as impactful when we operate in trauma-informed ways. And of course, good self-care is a really important part of this, and good team care, as we know. And as Justin, you say, I love this notion that we get internal rewards from treating people in this way. And that in and of itself is a form of self-care even, right? All right. I'm I'm going to show a video and then it's going to be time for us to go, but maybe this is a good way to end our time together. And this was made for healthcare clinics, but I think it will be instructive for just providing a synopsis of what we're talking about here. So let's give it a listen.
You know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover? Well, the same is true when you assess a patient. Hi, I'm Dr. Cruz. Early in my career, I noticed a pattern with some of my patients. They often had multiple health issues, were uneasy during office visits, and frequently visited the emergency department. But worst of all, they never got better despite multiple visits. Then I realized something. From an early age, many of my patients were exposed to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This includes emotional, sexual, or physical abuse, violence, neglect, discrimination, poverty, and other adverse events. ACEs are more common in the US than you'd think. In fact, 60% of US adults have one ACE, 25% have 3 or more ACEs, and 16% have 4 or more. ACEs occur in all socioeconomic groups, but are more common in low-income and minority populations. For young children, repeated exposure to trauma can impact brain development and literally rewire the brain's response to stress. So as they grow up, many struggle with issues related to emotional regulation, like depression, anxiety, or substance use disorders. Trauma survivors are also more often at risk for chronic diseases, behavioral health problems, and even suicide. Knowing all this, I began to rethink my approach to care. Instead of asking patients, "What's wrong with you?" I ask, "What happened to you?" Recognizing that life experiences are often a root cause of poor health is integral to improving patient care. Trauma-informed care has helped me take these experiences into account, providing greater insight into my patients' needs and how to address them. Here are 5 key ways that healthcare organizations can gradually integrate trauma-informed care into their practices to help patients and staff. First, build awareness and generate buy-in. Involve both staff and patients in adopting a trauma-informed approach. Second, invest in a trauma-informed workforce. Hire staff that embrace trauma-informed care and provide training not only for clinical staff, but also for non-clinical employees like front desk workers or security guards, who are often the face of your organization. Next, create an environment that is safe and welcoming for patients and staff. Engage patients in meaningful ways. Ask how they feel and listen. You can also build trust by involving them in their own treatment planning. Finally, identify and treat trauma. Consider a screening approach that works for your patients and ensure that treatments and referral sources are available. These changes take time, but each step improves our ability to connect with and care for patients. Today, our patients appreciate the changes we've made. Plus, our staff is more in tune with patients, so work is less stressful and more rewarding. Trauma-informed care. It can truly transform the caregiving experience from being treaters to being healers.
All right, I'm going to provide these slides for you, and I'm going through them just because I want to get to a particular slide, but if you can speed read, you can pick up a few nuggets here and there, and then I know we're going to have to come to a close. I think one of the things I wanted to point out is you're going to see some slides about helping people feel safer and more comfortable, and I hope that you might take those and take a look at them. And then as we bring this to a close, I just wanted to leave you with a brief quote, and it's this from Father Gregory Boyle: "The compassion we seek is that which stands in awe at what people have to carry, rather than stand in judgment about how they carry it." And I think that's a good mantra to carry forward in providing trauma-informed care. And so with that, I'll say farewell. Thank you. A pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you for your participation in all kinds of ways. And I hope the remainder of your day goes well.
Thanks, Ken. I posted the link in the chat for anyone that needs to record their attendance for the Eastern or Western PA CoC. And if you are a registered attendee, you'll get an email with the follow-up materials and the recording, and they'll also be posted on the CoC website. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ken. We'll see everyone in a couple weeks.
Thank you.